The trucks came before sunrise, 7 of them, lined up on Ridgeline Road like something out of a fever dream, each one loaded with dark, steaming mounds that smelled like rain-soaked earth and rotting leaves. By 7 a.m., a small crowd had gathered at the fence line. Neighbors, a few men from the co-op down the road, somebody's teenage kid holding a phone up for video. One of the older farmers, a guy named Hector Brannigan, who'd worked the county for 40 years, crossed his arms and shook his head slowly. "She actually asked them to bring more," he said to no one in particular. More. When the first load had arrived 2 weeks earlier, unexpected, uninvited, dumped right across her dead front field, most people assumed it was an accident, a mistake, maybe a lawsuit waiting to happen. But Delray Combs hadn't called a lawyer. She'd called the facility back and asked them what they were planning to do with the rest of it. If you've ever looked at something everyone else wrote off and thought, "Wait, there's something here," this story was made for you. Subscribe for more stories about real people who found opportunity exactly where others stopped looking. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We genuinely want to know. Delray Combs was 34 years old when her grandmother died and left her the farm. She was working 2 jobs at the time, bookkeeping for a dental practice in town and waitressing Friday and Saturday nights. She drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked windshield and owned exactly nothing worth inheriting. The farm wasn't a gift, not really. It was 80 acres of compacted clay soil, overgrown fence lines, a barn with a caved-in roof section, and a well that needed a new pump. The previous tenant had walked away 3 years earlier, and the land had been sitting ever since, packed hard as parking lot concrete, stripped of anything useful. Delray knew nothing about farming. She'd grown up in Columbus, she knew spreadsheets, she knew how to stay calm when a table of 8 asked for separate checks at 11 p.m. But she also knew how to read a number, and when she ran the math on selling the land versus holding it, she decided to hold. She moved into the farmhouse in March. She was completely broke by April. "I had about $900, and the most optimistic interpretation of potential I've ever heard myself use," she'd later say. She started small. She tilled a half-acre behind the house with a borrowed tractor, tested the soil at the county extension office, and read the results like they were written in Mandarin. The soil was depleted, organic matter was under 1%, pH was off. There was almost no biological activity, no earthworms, no microbial life worth measuring, just dead dirt. The extension agent, a patient woman named Carla Whiteside, told her the truth without sugarcoating it. "This land is going to take years of work before it produces anything worth selling." Delray thanked her and drove home quietly. Then, 3 weeks later, the first delivery showed up. 1 truck, then 2 more behind it, unannounced. Emerald Valley Composting operated a 40-acre processing facility about 12 miles north of Delray's farm. They composted food waste from grocery chains, yard debris from 3 county municipalities, and agricultural byproducts from a regional grain processor. In a good year, they processed over 18,000 tons of finished compost. That spring had been a problem year. A major landscaping contract had fallen through after the company's biggest municipal buyer switched suppliers. Storage bays were full. A third of their finished product, fully cured, grade A compost, had nowhere to go. Hauling it to landfill would cost them more than $40,000 in tipping fees. They needed land, any land. Someone on staff knew about the empty acreage off Ridgeline Road. Delray had said yes before they finished the sentence. Not because she fully understood what she was agreeing to, but because compost, she'd just read, was essentially biology made solid. Here's the basic science. When organic waste breaks down under the right conditions, it transforms. Carbon-rich materials like wood chips and dried leaves combine with nitrogen-rich materials like food scraps and grass clippings. Microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes, go to work breaking everything down. Heat builds inside the pile, killing pathogens. Over weeks and months, the raw waste becomes something almost miraculous, a dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling material teeming with microbial life that can fundamentally rebuild depleted soil. Compost adds organic matter. Organic matter feeds microbes. Microbes release nutrients. Nutrients feed plants. Healthy soil retains water, resists erosion, and produces higher yields with fewer chemical inputs. Carla had told Del Rey that rebuilding her soil would take years. But that was without 150 tons of finished compost sitting in her front field, with the promise of more still to come. She spent 6 weeks spreading that first delivery. She rented equipment she barely knew how to operate. She watched YouTube tutorials in the evenings. She called Carla twice a week with questions. She pulled muscles she didn't know she had. By June, she'd worked compost into 15 acres. She planted zucchini, bush beans, and a trial quarter-acre of heirloom tomatoes she'd found at a seed swap in Zanesville. Then it rained for 11 days straight. The low-lying section of the field flooded. She lost her bean seedlings entirely. Water pooled between rows where she hadn't accounted for drainage. 3 weeks of planting, gone. She sat in the barn that evening with her boots still wet, looking at a field that looked worse than when she'd started. She could have quit then. A reasonable person might have. Instead, she called a tile drainage contractor, got a quote she couldn't afford, and spent a weekend on the phone until she found a retired farmer 2 towns over who would walk the field with her for $200 and a home-cooked meal. His name was Warren Tully, and he spent 3 hours showing her how to read the land, where water wanted to go, where it was being blocked, which sections would drain naturally if she just modified a few berms. Land will tell you what it needs, Warren told her, if you're quiet enough to listen. She hand-dug 6 drainage channels over the next 2 weeks. By late July, the tomatoes were producing. Not enough to sell, but enough to prove the soil was waking up. She started a worm bin in the barn, using kitchen scraps and coffee grounds. Red wigglers working through food waste and producing castings so nutrient-dense that mixing just a cup into potting soil changed the color of seedlings within a week. She began saving that concentrate like it was medicine. Emerald Valley called again in August. They had another surplus. This time, Del Rey negotiated. They would deliver. She would provide the transport receipts they needed for their compliance records, and she'd take all 400 tons. The neighbors talked. The following spring changed everything. The compost-amended soil had spent a full winter cycling nutrients. Earthworms had moved in. Real earthworm populations, the kind that aerate soil naturally and create channels for root systems. Del Rey tested the organic matter content in March. It had climbed from under 1% to nearly 4.5% in the most heavily amended sections. She planted 4 acres of mixed heirloom tomatoes, 3 acres of winter squash, and a half-acre of specialty herbs, basil, thyme, lemon verbena, that she'd read restaurants were willing to pay a premium for. She also got her soil tested for organic certification eligibility through the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association. The land qualified. The previous tenant had abandoned it more than 3 years before she arrived, meaning no synthetic fertilizers or pesticides had touched the soil in well over the required transition period. Her grandmother's neglected acres had accidentally become an organic farm in waiting. She applied. The process took 8 months and more paperwork than she'd done in a decade of bookkeeping. But when the certification came through, her price per pound didn't just improve, it nearly doubled. She started at the Waverly Farmers Market that summer with a card table and a handmade sign. By week 3, she'd sold out before noon. By week 7, a chef from a farm-to-table restaurant in Columbus was standing at her table, asking if she could supply them directly. She said yes. Then she went home and figured out how. Labor was the next crisis. She couldn't harvest, pack, and deliver alone. She hired 2 part-time workers, a retired school principal named Odalise Ferris, who turned out to have an extraordinary eye for harvest timing, and a young guy named Cade Tillman, who could fix anything mechanical and didn't mind starting at 5 a.m. By the end of that second season, Del Rey had cleared $84,000 in revenue. Not profit, revenue. There were equipment loans, supply costs, certification fees, market stall dues, but it was real money from real soil that 2 years earlier couldn't grow a dandelion. She called Emerald Valley again. This time she proposed a formal agreement. They would deliver surplus compost on a scheduled basis. She would provide them documentation for their sustainability reporting, documentation that helped them secure a new municipal contract. Both parties would benefit. Hector Brannigan, the old farmer who'd shaken his head at the fence line the spring before, knocked on her door one October afternoon. "I want to know what you did with that south field," he said, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands. He paused. "I told people this land would take a generation to recover." She made him coffee and told him everything. By year 4, Ridgeline Farm was producing on 38 acres. Del Rey had added 2 high tunnels for year-round herb production, installed irrigation fed by a repaired pond, and built a small cold storage unit in the renovated barn. She had 6 employees, a weekly restaurant delivery route serving 4 kitchens in Columbus and 2 in Chillicothe, and a modest but growing presence at 3 regional farmers markets. Her revenue crossed $1.1 million in year 5, not as a sudden event, but as the quiet result of 5 years of compounding improvement. $1 million harvest, grown from what everyone else called waste. The soil that had registered under 1% organic matter now averaged 6.8% across her core production acreage. That number represented millions of microorganisms per teaspoon of earth. Water retention that meant she could go 2 weeks without irrigation during dry spells, and root systems on her tomato plants that grew 3 feet deep into living soil, rather than fighting through packed clay. She spoke at an agricultural extension conference the following spring. Hector sat in the 3rd row. She wasn't polished. She stumbled on a few slides. But when she held up a jar of finished compost from Emerald Valley and said, "This is what the trucks brought," the room was completely quiet. "Somebody else's waste became my foundation," she said. "That's not luck. That's just paying attention." Ridgeline Farm didn't become what it is because of a lucky break. It became what it is because one person looked at something everyone else dismissed: dead land, surplus compost, a facility's costly problem, and saw a system that could be rebuilt from the ground up, literally. The composting facility is still delivering. Del Rey is still taking everything they have. And the land that Hector Brannigan, standing on her porch, hat in hand, once admitted he'd written off for a generation, is now producing some of the most nutrient-dense vegetables in central Ohio. There's a quote that hangs above the doorway of Del Rey's barn office. She found it while researching soil biology in her 2nd year, scrawled it on a note card, and never took it down. It comes from George Washington Carver, who transformed depleted southern soils and created abundance from what others had exhausted. When you can do the common things of life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world. She wasn't trying to command anyone's attention. She was just trying to grow something, and it turned out that was enough.